Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the night of March 2nd, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Pucheta rode his motorcycle down a dirt road in rural Argentina. It was pitch black out with no streetlights, and on either side of the road were mostly open fields, interspersed with patches of forest, and there were mountains rising up in the background. There was nobody around him for miles. This was an area called La Pampa, and it was famous for its beautiful landscapes and cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers, who came out here at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and birds that often sold for lots of money on the black market. It had been a quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something illegal. At around 10 p.m., Sergio was riding down the road towards a crossroads that locals called El Cruce de las Cañas, and up ahead he saw the red taillights of a car. And at first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into this nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field, and then these taillights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. Maybe, he thought, this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide from Sergio. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and he parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out, it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he didn't bother to take it out because he didn't want to give away his position. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this vegetation the car had gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. I mean, the entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact. And so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he couldn't find any. Like there was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation. And so eventually, Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange chirring sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he couldn't just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. So he took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glint in the darkness. And for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought, that's got to be the car. I've caught them. They're right here. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring, so terrifying that for a second, he just stood there frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him, so he opened his phone and said hello. But Sergio didn't say hello back. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Cañas. You know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, what's going on here, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio didn't answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio. And so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too. Because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him. Every time they had tried to call him back, he wasn't answering. Meanwhile, the backup, 3 police cars full of officers, sped past cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas, where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, like his actual location, they found his motorcycle, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle, and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down, looking for any sign of Sergio. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, "Over here!" Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought, okay, well, maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger until finally the gap from one step to the next was 10 feet apart, then 15 feet apart, and then 20 feet apart. I mean, even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance to cover. I mean, this was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear. There was no mistaking this was a human footprint. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints. But now they just walked in silence. For more than 1 mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and trees until they arrived at a cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour at around 2 a.m. But the officers never gave up. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police couldn't find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and he saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting in the mud. Now, keep in mind, this area is like in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through the area, and so to see anybody was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so, feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man, but didn't get a response, and so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped around him, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer couldn't see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining, and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet, this man was totally dry. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Sir, are you okay?" But the officer didn't react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It didn't take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Pucheta. But Sergio wouldn't talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He didn't appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with him. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss to see if he could get Sergio to respond. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the ground, but still Sergio wouldn't speak. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him and then went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio didn't want anybody to touch him, and he was very anxious, and he kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have injuries. I mean, he figured he had likely been assaulted or kidnapped. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he'd been standing on a hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk. And here is the totally wild story that he told. At 10 p.m. the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he didn't. There was no car. There were no poachers. When he turned, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then before he could do anything, the eyes began to move closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes, these were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they didn't appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that's when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. But then suddenly he felt this intense pressure in his torso, and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever seemed to be in control of him, but he couldn't. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards, like his back is arched in this totally unnatural position, and he's marching out of the trees. And then as he's doing this, he watched helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone. And then he dialed the number of that officer, and then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend, "Come to Las Cañas, you know what to do." And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassemble it and drop the pieces on the ground. And then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures are just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he didn't hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky. And for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again, he was lifted back up. And this time, he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again, and again, and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they didn't stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield, and as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw were swaying corn stalks and darkness, and for a moment he's thinking, maybe this is all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then, once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him are two red glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself. But it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas.
On May 15th, 1997, a 27-year-old man named Jedith Rodrigo was enjoying a quiet evening in his RV near the Everglades National Park in Florida. His German Shepherd, who had been his faithful companion for years, was laying at his feet as he watched TV. And so around 9 p.m. that night, his dog started acting strangely, pawing at the door, wanting to go outside. Now, Jedith didn't think much of it. His dog was well trained and normally just needed a quick bathroom break before bed. And so he opened the RV door and let his shepherd out into the darkness. But then, just moments later, he heard a single yelp from his dog. Now, the man had owned this shepherd for years, and he had never heard his dog make a sound like that before. And so he grabbed his flashlight, and he headed outside to check on his pet. And as he stepped out of his RV, he kind of just flooded the area with the light, sweeping the beam back and forth across the ground. Now, at first, he didn't see anything unusual, but then his light caught something that made him freeze in place. Because standing there, not 20 feet away, was some kind of creature. It was almost yellow in color, about 3 feet tall, and the man estimated it weighed around 100 pounds. The thing that really caught his attention, though, were its eyes. They were kind of glowing green, and strangest of all, they continued glowing even when the flashlight beam hit them directly. And so Jedith stood there trembling, holding onto the flashlight as he took in more details of this thing. It also had 5 distinct spines running down its back, each one about 2.5 feet long. But he saw something at its feet. It was his German Shepherd, and the creature was actively feeding on him. His dog was a 120-pound shepherd who had once fought off 2 coyotes that had gotten into their backyard in Tampa, and now its body lay completely lifeless on the ground. But despite his terror, he just started screaming, "Hey, get away from him!" But when the thing's head snapped up, it let out this screeching sound, and it was so horrible, it almost sounded mechanical, like metal grinding against metal. And then in one fluid motion, it turned and ran off into the darkness on 2 legs, moving faster than any person Jedith had ever seen. So he rushed over to his dog, his flashlight beam is kind of just shaking as he approached, and what he saw made him physically sick. His dog's neck was completely twisted backward, and there were 2 distinct fang marks in its throat. The really strange thing was, when Jedith put his hand on his dog's body, it felt hollow. It was like everything inside had been drained out. And then just as Jedith was trying to process what was happening, he heard another screech in the distance. It was the same horrible sound, but this time it seemed to be answered by another one from a different direction. Now he's thinking there's more of them out there, they're communicating, I need to get out of here. Now he knew he had to do something to preserve the evidence of what had happened, and so despite being completely terrified, He scooped up his dog's body, and remember, this was a very large German Shepherd, carried him back to the RV, and the whole time he just keeps thinking, I've got to document this because nobody's going to believe me otherwise. Now, Jedith happened to work as a mortician back in Tampa, and so he knew something about preserving bodies. He managed to get his dog into the small RV bathtub, and he grabbed all the ice he had in his freezer and packed it around the body. Now at this point, he's hearing more of those strange mechanical screeching sounds outside, and they seem to be getting closer. And so Jedith just jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the RV, and just started driving. He didn't even pack up his camping gear or anything. He just left it all there. The nearest vet was in a town called Okapi, about 30 miles away. And the whole drive there, he just kept checking his rearview mirror, convinced he was going to see one of those things following him. He pulled into the vet's parking lot at around 11:45 that night, and even though the place was technically closed, they had an emergency number posted on the door. When the vet, Dr. Martinez, arrived 20 minutes later, Jedith was still sitting in his RV, too scared to get out. Now, as Dr. Martinez examined his dog's body, his face went completely white. And Jedith even noticed that the vet's hands were still as he looked at those fang marks. And the vet just stopped and stared at him for a long moment. And he says to Jedith, look, I need you to tell me exactly where this happened. Was it near the old canal system? When Jedith nodded yes, the vet just walked over to the filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder. Inside were dozens of photographs, all showing different animals with the same injuries as his dog, like cattle, even a horse, all with broken necks and the same fang marks. Now, Dr. Martinez explained to Jedith that this had been happening for months. Authorities wouldn't listen. They kept saying it's just panthers or bears, but he's been a vet in the Everglades for 22 years and has never seen any natural predator do this. Dr. Martinez closed the folder and explained that whatever this thing is, it's not stopping. He showed Jedith a map where he'd marked all the attacks, and they formed a clear pattern moving steadily north through the Everglades. The attacks were getting more frequent and closer to populated areas. He told Jedith that just last week, something had killed 3 guard dogs at a construction site near Naples. The security camera footage mysteriously disappeared, and the local PD had written it off as vandalism. But those dogs had the exact same marks. Jedith's mind was completely blown. He has no idea how this wasn't public knowledge. How are all these people out camping and hiking with no warning? Now, he asked the vet why nobody was talking about this, and the vet's response really bothered him. He explained that every time somebody reported these incidents to Fish and Wildlife or the police, strange men in unmarked vehicles would show up within hours. They'd confiscate any evidence and tell witnesses it was just a bear attack, don't talk about it. But bears don't drain their prey completely of blood, and they certainly don't leave those distinctive fang marks. The vet went on to tell Jedith about a local ranger who had tried to go public with similar findings 3 months ago. He had photos, videos, even plaster casts of bizarre footprints, but the day before his scheduled press conference, he suddenly quit his job and moved out of state. Nobody had heard from him since. Now at this point, Jedith noticed the vet kept glancing nervously out the window into the parking lot. Dr. Martinez lowered his voice and told Jedith that he needed to leave now. And he said he'd already told him too much, but he couldn't stay quiet anymore. Too many animals were dying. And as Jedith got up to leave, the vet grabbed his arm and told him one last thing. He said there was something he hadn't shown anyone else yet. 2 days ago, he'd found something embedded in one of the fang marks on a dead cow. It looked like a metallic tooth, but it wasn't made of any material he'd ever seen before. But before he could show it to Jedith, they both heard a familiar sound coming from behind the clinic. It was that same mechanical screeching that Jedith had heard in the Everglades. He practically ran to his RV, jumped inside, locked every door and window. He pulled down all the shades, but it didn't matter. He could still hear the same screeching outside his RV all night long. Now at some point, he must have fallen asleep because he had this vivid dream of bright lights and tall glowing figures standing over him. But when he woke up the next morning, he couldn't remember any details. Just fragments that slipped away like smoke whenever he tried to focus on them. At around 8 in the morning, there was a knock on his RV door. When he opened it, there were 3 men in black suits standing there. They didn't introduce themselves or show any badges, they just started talking. They informed him that Dr. Martinez had decided to suddenly retire last night and had already moved away to spend time with family. They told Jedith that his dog's body had been disposed of due to health concerns and handed him a document stating his dog had died from a rare viral infection. One of the men explained that signing this document would entitle him to financial compensation for his loss. The tallest of the three pulled out another document, a non-disclosure agreement. He told Jedith that everything that happened last night was classified information relating to national security. If he ever spoke about what he saw in the Everglades or his conversation with the vet, he would face severe legal consequences. Well, it would not be until years later where Jedith confided his story to several sources under the guise of complete anonymity. The events of that night in May of 1997 were never officially explained. The strange creatures, the vanishing vet, the mysterious men in suits, and the dozens of unexplained animal deaths throughout the Everglades, the truth behind it all is unknown.